The autumn of 1892 brought a dry, brittle heat to the Northern California foothills, the kind of season ranchers along the Feather River had learned to fear more than any winter storm. Every blade of grass and every stand of timber waiting like tinder for a single careless spark. The air itself carrying a tension that settled over the entire county well before the actual fire ever broke out. Thomas Whitfield stood outside the Butte County jailhouse on a Tuesday morning in October, his daughter Nell gripping his hand tightly, 5 years old and confused by the deputy's firm hand on her father's shoulder the previous evening. Thomas had spent the night in a cell accused of setting the fire that had burned nearly 200 acres of the Ashworth timber operation to the ground, a blaze that had come dangerously close to consuming the ranch's main barn and had cost a season's worth of cleared lumber. He had not started that fire. He knew this with absolute certainty, though he had no way yet of proving it to a county desperate for someone to blame. He did not know that the woman who owned the very timber operation the fire had nearly destroyed would arrive at the courthouse that same week and offer testimony that would leave the entire courtroom in stunned silence, testimony that would ultimately save both his freedom and his daughter's future. Thomas Whitfield had once operated a modest lumber mill along the Feather River, honest work that had supported his wife Charlotte and their small daughter, until a flood 2 years earlier destroyed his mill equipment entirely, the river rising with a suddenness no one in the county had properly anticipated. Charlotte had died the following winter, a wasting fever that took her within weeks, and Thomas had buried her himself beneath a stand of oak because he could not afford to pay another man for the labor. Since then, he had taken whatever day labor the county offered, and 3 days before the fire, he had accepted temporary work-clearing brush along the eastern edge of the Ashworth timber operation, work that placed him uncomfortably close to the origin point once the fire investigators began their inquiry. Beatrice Ashworth had inherited the largest timber and grazing operation in Butte County from her late husband Nathaniel, a man who had built the Ashworth spread from a small homestead into the most prosperous timber operation in the northern foothills before a felling accident took him 3 years earlier. A massive sugar pine falling wrong and crushing him instantly despite every safety precaution his crew had properly observed. She was 36 years old, and she had spent those 3 years running the operation with a careful, determined competence that had earned her respect throughout the county, learning timber markets and mill operations with the same diligence she had once applied to supporting Nathaniel's own ambitious plans for the operation's expansion. The grand house she occupied alone had grown considerably quieter with each passing season, 7 years of marriage having never produced the children she and Nathaniel had both quietly hoped for. A private grief she carried beneath her composed public presence, rarely speaking of it even to the few friends who might have offered genuine comfort had she allowed herself to properly ask for it. Sheriff Otis Pryor had arrested Thomas the previous evening based largely on circumstantial evidence. His presence near the fire's origin point, combined with a desperate man's obvious financial motive to potentially collect on the timber's insured value through some manner of arrangement, investigators had not yet properly explained, but seemed prepared to assume regardless. "I was clearing brush a full quarter-mile from where the fire started," Thomas told the sheriff repeatedly through the previous night's questioning. "I saw the smoke same as every other hand on that section, and I helped fight it same as everyone else until it finally burned itself out near the creek." Sheriff Pryor remained unmoved by the protests. "You'll have your chance to explain yourself properly before Judge Holloway," he said. "Until then, you'll remain in custody, Whitfield. A fire this size, this close to costing lives along with the timber, the county can't simply take a desperate man's word that he's innocent of everything." Thomas's daughter Nell had been left in the temporary care of a neighbor woman through the night, and when Thomas was finally permitted a brief visit with her the following morning before his formal hearing, her frightened, confused face nearly broke what remained of his composure entirely. Beatrice Ashworth arrived at the Butte County Courthouse 3 days later, on the morning Thomas's formal hearing was scheduled to begin, the small courtroom already crowded with curious townsfolk drawn by word of a fire serious enough to warrant a full criminal proceeding. Nell sat in the back with the neighbor woman who had cared for her through the previous days, her small face pale and frightened as she watched her father seated alone at the defense table. What Beatrice did once seated in that crowded courtroom left everyone present, including Thomas himself, entirely unprepared for what followed. The county prosecutor, a confident man named Cornelius Bragg, who represented the timber insurance company's interests alongside the county's own case, presented his circumstantial evidence with practiced precision, describing Thomas's proximity to the fire's origin, his obvious financial desperation, and speculating that a man with nothing left to lose might reasonably consider arson a path toward insurance-related compensation through some arrangement with parties who stood to benefit from the timber's destroyed value being properly documented and claimed. When Bragg finished, Judge Holloway asked whether the defense had any witnesses to call, and Thomas's court-appointed lawyer, a young, inexperienced man named Percival Doyle, who had taken the case with considerable reluctance, admitted he had found no one willing to testify on Thomas's behalf beyond character references of limited legal weight. It was then that Beatrice Ashworth rose from her seat in the crowded gallery and requested the court's permission to testify. A murmur moved through the courtroom immediately, every head turning toward the county's wealthiest widow, whose own timber operation had suffered the fire's considerable damage, and who might reasonably have been expected to support the prosecution's case rather than the defendant's, given the substantial personal loss her own property had already sustained. "Mrs. Ashworth," Judge Holloway said, clearly surprised himself, "you may certainly testify, though I confess I hadn't anticipated the defense calling a witness from the very party whose property suffered this fire's damage." Beatrice approached the witness stand with visible composure, despite the courtroom's evident astonishment. "I'm not testifying for the defense in any formal sense, Your Honor," she said. "I'm testifying to what I personally witnessed the afternoon of the fire, which I believe this court has not yet properly heard, because no one has thought to ask me directly, rather than relying entirely on second-hand reports and circumstantial speculation." What Beatrice said next shocked the entire courtroom into a silence so complete that even Cornelius Bragg's confident posture visibly faltered. "I was riding the eastern boundary of my own property that afternoon, checking a fence line my foreman had reported as damaged," she said. "I saw Mr. Whitfield clearing brush exactly where he claims to have been working, a full quarter-mile from where the fire actually originated. I saw the smoke begin at a considerable distance from his location, near the old logging equipment shed that my late husband's crew abandoned 2 seasons ago due to its deteriorating condition. I did not report this immediately because I assumed, incorrectly it now seems, that the sheriff's investigation would properly establish these same facts through basic examination of the fire's actual point of origin, rather than simply assuming guilt based on a desperate man's unfortunate proximity to a much larger area of active work." Cornelius Bragg rose immediately, visibly unsettled by testimony that undermined his entire circumstantial case. "Mrs. Ashworth, you're suggesting the fire began somewhere other than where Mr. Whitfield was working, based on your own observation. From what distance exactly?" Beatrice held his gaze steadily. "Approximately 300 yards, Mr. Bragg. Riding a boundary line, I know considerably better than any investigator who arrived after the fact to examine ash and speculation rather than the actual sequence of events I personally witnessed unfolding." Judge Holloway leaned forward with evident interest. "Mrs. Ashworth, would you be willing to guide the court's investigators to this old equipment shed you've described so the actual point of origin might be properly examined rather than assumed?" Beatrice nodded firmly. "I would insist upon it, Your Honor. I have a considerable financial interest in understanding exactly what destroyed 200 acres of my own timber, and I find myself increasingly troubled that this investigation proceeded as far as a formal arrest without anyone properly examining the fire's actual origin point." The court adjourned for 3 days while investigators, guided by Beatrice's precise description, examined the abandoned equipment shed and the surrounding area considerably more carefully than the initial hasty investigation had apparently managed. What they found proved decisive, evidence of old, deteriorated machinery oil that had likely combusted spontaneously in the unusual autumn heat, precisely the kind of hazard Beatrice's own foreman had flagged for removal months earlier in a report that had, through unfortunate oversight, never been properly acted upon. Thomas Whitfield's innocence was established beyond reasonable dispute, and Judge Holloway dismissed all charges against him the following week, expressing considerable frustration that the initial investigation had proceeded so hastily toward circumstantial arrest rather than proper examination of physical evidence. Outside the courthouse following his release, Thomas found himself utterly overwhelmed, Nell running to him the moment he stepped through the doors, small arms wrapping tight around his legs while he knelt to properly gather her close, and Beatrice waiting nearby with an expression that suggested she had more to discuss than simply the satisfaction of justice properly served. "I don't know how to thank you," Thomas said, his voice unsteady with a gratitude he struggled to properly express. "You didn't have to involve yourself in any of this, Mrs. Ashworth. Most people in your position would have simply let the investigation proceed however it wished, particularly given your own property suffered the fire's damage." Beatrice studied him for a long moment. "I couldn't watch an innocent man convicted for a fire I personally witnessed him having no part in starting," she said. "That would have been considerably worse than any financial loss the fire itself cost me." She hesitated slightly before continuing. "I understand your circumstances have grown rather desperate since the flood took your mill, Mr. Whitfield. I find myself with a genuine need for someone who understands timber and mill operations to help rebuild what the fire destroyed, considerably more capably than my current staff has managed on their own. I'd like to discuss employment if you're interested, once you and your daughter have properly recovered from this ordeal." Thomas considered this carefully, weighing months of desperate wandering against an offer that arrived from the very woman who had just saved his freedom. "I'll need to understand exactly what the work would involve," he said, "before I can properly answer, and I'd want it understood plainly that I'm not accepting out of some sense of obligation for what you did in that courtroom." Beatrice's expression shifted into something that might have been the beginning of respect at his careful, deliberate caution. "A fair condition," she said. "Come see the operation properly once you're settled. Decide for yourself whether the work suits you, entirely separate from whatever gratitude either of us might reasonably feel toward the other." Thomas accepted the position 2 weeks later, after a proper inspection confirmed the timber operation's genuine need for skilled milling knowledge his own ruined business had once provided in abundance. The small cottage near the main sawmill, when he and Nell moved into it, sat considerably closer to comfortable than the rented room they'd occupied since Charlotte's death, and Nell claimed the smaller bedroom with quiet delight, running her small hand along the real glass window pane as though she could scarcely believe such comfort belonged to her now. That first night, Thomas sat beside his sleeping daughter a long while, still faintly disbelieving of how completely their circumstances had shifted since a terrifying night in a jailhouse cell he'd feared might mark the beginning of losing everything rather than the start of something genuinely new. By the second morning, Nell had already discovered the cottage's small window overlooking the mill, standing pressed against the glass watching the machinery work with an attention that suggested she found the whole operation genuinely fascinating rather than merely unfamiliar. Thomas threw himself into rebuilding the fire-damaged operation with the same careful discipline that had once made his own mill respected along the Feather River. And within 2 months, the Ashworth operation's milling capacity had not merely recovered from the fire's damage, but exceeded its previous output considerably. His pride flared once, in early November, when Beatrice arranged for new milling equipment to be delivered without first consulting him, intending the gesture as simple practicality, but which Thomas initially received as unwelcome charity dressed up as operational necessity. "I can make do with what survived the fire, Mrs. Ashworth," he said, more sharply than he'd intended, when she came to see the equipment properly installed. Beatrice studied him a long moment before responding, her own composure steady despite his tone. "I don't doubt that you can," she said, "but proper equipment means considerably faster rebuilding, and I'd rather not watch you strain yourself proving a point about pride that neither of us particularly needs proven twice in one season. Accept the equipment, Mr. Whitfield. Consider it simple business sense rather than charity, because that's genuinely all it is." Thomas stood there a long moment, feeling the sting of his own overcorrected pride, before finally nodding once, gruffly, and thanking her properly. Beatrice found herself visiting the cottage most evenings, First, under the excuse of reviewing the rebuilding progress herself, though the truth ran considerably deeper with every visit that passed. She brought Nell small gifts and sat with her by the hearth while Thomas finished his evening work, discovering in herself a warmth toward the girl that startled her after 7 childless years of marriage and 3 more of solitary grief. One evening, she found a small carved wooden pine cone resting on the porch rail, a fitting gesture given the operation's business. No note attached, the wood still faintly warm from the whittling knife, and she knew exactly whose hands had made it, keeping it in her coat pocket for several days before finding the words to properly thank him. Word of the arrangement spread through Butte County exactly as Thomas had feared it might. Women at the Mercantile whispered that the widow Ashworth had employed the very man recently cleared of burning her own timber, that grief and gratitude together had clearly overtaken her usually sound business judgment. Thomas heard fragments of this himself at the Mercantile counter, though considerably less than he'd feared, the county's own awareness of the sheriff's hasty original investigation softening much of the gossip that might otherwise have circulated more freely. Sheriff Pryor himself, initially embarrassed by the hasty arrest his own investigation had produced, eventually spoke plainly in Thomas's defense one evening at the Mercantile counter, his admission carrying particular weight given his own role in the original injustice. "I arrested an innocent man based on evidence I should have examined considerably more carefully before proceeding," Pryor admitted. "Whatever this county wants to whisper about Whitfield's employment, I'd say the man's earned considerably more benefit of the doubt than my own investigation originally extended him." Beatrice heard the rest of the whispers herself and let them slide past her like rain off an oiled coat. One evening in early December, sitting by the cottage hearth after Nell had fallen asleep, Beatrice found herself reflecting aloud on everything the preceding months had revealed. "I nearly didn't attend your hearing at all," she admitted to Thomas. "I told myself the sheriff's investigation would properly handle matters, that involving myself directly wasn't strictly necessary. I keep thinking about how differently everything might have concluded had I simply stayed home that morning." Thomas considered this. "But you didn't stay home," he said. "You showed up and told the truth of what you'd actually seen, regardless of how inconvenient that truth proved for the prosecution's case." Beatrice's eyes filled with a grief of her own, carefully guarded across 7 years of marriage and 3 more of solitary mourning. "Nathaniel always said a person's true character shows most clearly in the moments when silence would be considerably easier than speaking up," she said quietly. "I've spent 3 years telling myself I honored his memory simply by maintaining what he built. Watching you and Nell these past weeks, I've come to understand that honoring someone's memory sometimes requires rather more than careful preservation. It requires actually living according to the values they held, even when doing so cost something." Thomas reached across and took her hand. "Tell me about Nathaniel," he said softly. Beatrice managed a small, unsteady smile. "Principled to a fault," she said. "He'd have been the first person in that courtroom demanding a proper investigation before anyone's freedom was decided on assumption alone. He used to say a man's worth wasn't measured by how loudly he defended his own interests, but by whether he'd speak up for someone else's, when doing so cost him something real." She was quiet a moment. "What was Charlotte like?" she asked. Thomas considered the question a long while. "Patient with me in ways I probably didn't deserve," he said. "She never once complained when the flood took everything we'd built, just started planning what came next before I'd even finished grieving what we'd lost. I think about that a great deal, watching you rebuild this operation with that same steady patience rather than simply mourning what the fire destroyed." Beatrice studied him. "I think that's precisely why I couldn't simply stay home that morning, whatever my own initial hesitation suggested," she said finally. "Some part of me recognized in you exactly the kind of quiet resilience Nathaniel always valued most. We are more than halfway through Beatrice and Thomas's story now, and if a widow's courtroom testimony has stirred something in you, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next tale from this same forgotten stretch of the California frontier. What do you think will happen as Beatrice and Thomas grow closer while rebuilding the fire-damaged operation together?" Tell us in the comments which moment in Thomas's ordeal moved you most so far. Now, back to Butte County, where the rebuilt operation was about to face one final test. The following spring brought a challenge neither had properly anticipated when the timber insurance company, having paid out considerable compensation for the fire's damage, launched its own investigation, questioning whether Beatrice's foreman's earlier report about the deteriorated equipment should constituted negligence sufficient to reduce or deny her claim entirely, arguing the company shouldn't bear full responsibility for a hazard Beatrice's own operation had apparently known about and failed to properly address. A formal hearing was scheduled to determine whether Beatrice would retain her insurance settlement or forfeit a substantial portion of it to the company's negligence claim, a financial blow that would considerably complicate the operation's continued rebuilding efforts. Beatrice spent several anxious days reviewing her own records alongside her lawyer, uncertain whether sufficient documentation existed to properly counter the company's argument, the mounting stress visible in ways that reminded Thomas uncomfortably of watching her testify months earlier under considerably different but equally difficult circumstances. Thomas, reviewing the original foreman's report alongside Beatrice's own records, identified a crucial detail the insurance company's investigators had apparently overlooked. This report was filed with your insurance company directly as part of your annual policy review 6 months before the fire, he said, presenting the document to Beatrice with visible relief. The company's own representative signed acknowledgement of receiving it. They can't now claim ignorance of a hazard they were formally notified about and chose not to require addressed as a condition of continued coverage. Beatrice studied the document, understanding immediately its significance. This shifts the negligence question entirely onto the company's own inaction, she said, rather than any failure on my operations part to properly report the hazard. The hearing, held before the same Judge Holloway, who had presided over Thomas's original case, proved considerably shorter than anyone anticipated once Thomas's discovered documentation was properly presented. The insurance company's lawyer, confronted with clear evidence of his own client's prior knowledge and inaction, found his negligence argument entirely undermined, and Judge Holloway ruled decisively in Beatrice's favor, preserving her full settlement and additionally noting the company's own conduct warranted further scrutiny by territorial insurance regulators. Outside the courthouse afterward, Beatrice turned to Thomas with visible relief. "You saved this settlement," she said. "We saved it," Thomas corrected gently. "Together, same as everything else since that first hearing where you stood up for a stranger, you had every reason to simply let the court convict." Beatrice's breath caught, the careful composure she'd maintained through 3 years of solitary grief finally giving way entirely. "I offered you employment rebuilding my operation, Thomas," she whispered. "I find I want considerably more than that now. I want the man who found justice buried in old insurance paperwork with the same careful attention he once brought to defending his own innocence." Thomas did not answer with words. He crossed the small distance between them right there outside the courthouse and took her hands, and in the gathering spring afternoon, with Judge Holloway and several courthouse observers looking on, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of fleeting relief or public spectacle. It was a kiss of promise, of survival, of two people who had each buried someone they loved and had somehow, against every hard frontier odd, found their way to standing together in the wreckage of losses finally overcome. The Ashworth timber operation thrived through the following months, its rebuilding complete and its reputation for careful, honest management stronger than ever throughout the county. Spring deepened across the California foothills, wildflowers blooming first along the very boundary line where Beatrice had witnessed the fire's true origin. And Beatrice and Thomas were married beneath the oaks in a real ceremony, wildflowers gathered by hands from across the county, who had once merely whispered about the arrangement, and now came bearing gifts instead, and a fiddle player from the county seat donating his afternoon for free, saying afterward he had never seen two people look at each other quite the way they did that day. Nell stood as flower girl in a new dress of fine blue wool, and when the ceremony ended, she ran to Beatrice without prompting and called her mama for the very first time, small arms thrown around her waist with complete, uncomplicated certainty. Beatrice froze entirely still, one hand pressed to her heart, tears spilling freely down her face before she gathered Nell into her arms, holding her the way she had once dreamed of holding a daughter of her own, in a life that had finally, truly, stopped feeling empty. Years later, travelers passing through Butte County still spoke of the Ashworth timber operation, though most had long since started calling it something simpler, the finest milling operation in the northern foothills, born from a widow's refusal to let an innocent man face conviction for a crime she had personally witnessed him not committing. Sheriff Pryor, grown considerably more careful in his investigations following that difficult autumn, still told newcomers the story of that courtroom morning, always ending it the same way, that he had never seen a witness's simple, unflinching honesty accomplish what an entire hasty investigation had nearly destroyed, and doubted he ever would again. Nell herself, grown into a steady young woman who managed the mill's own records alongside her father, liked to tell visitors that she remembered almost nothing of that frightening night her father spent in a jailhouse cell, only that she had woken the next morning to a stranger's carriage waiting outside the courthouse, and that the stranger had, within a single season, become the only mother she had ever properly known. Above the mantel in the main house, beside the small carved wooden pine cone, worn smooth from years of handling, hung a framed record of the original court proceedings alongside the insurance company's later settlement ruling, kept as a reminder of exactly what honest testimony, offered at considerable personal complexity, had ultimately accomplished. "It started with a fire I witnessed, and a man I knew hadn't started it," Beatrice liked to say to anyone who asked about it. "And it ended with the truest family I ever thought I'd get to have." Family isn't always about the blood that runs in a person's veins. Sometimes it's about the people who tell the truth, even when silence would prove considerably easier, and choose, with everything they have, to make certain justice reaches the people who genuinely deserve it. It's about the hard bargains desperate people strike simply to survive a California autumn, and the quiet grace that can turn those bargains into something that lasts a lifetime, one honest testimony at a time, long after the courtroom where it all began has faded into little more than a fondly remembered beginning. If Thomas and Beatrice's story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which moment moved you most: the courtroom testimony, the insurance hearing, or the little girl who called her mama for the very first time. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still believes honest testimony can change the entire course of an innocent person's life. In our next story, a widowed schoolteacher offers a grieving rancher one impossible winter bargain, and neither of them expects what it will cost to keep it. This is a fictional frontier romance inspired by the real hardships of the American West, and while it touches on grief, poverty, and the fear of false accusation, every difficult moment has been told with care and without graphic detail, brought to life here for your entertainment. Until the next trail, keep your fire burning and your heart open to the stranger at your gate. God bless the pioneers, and God bless the hearts that refuse to break.